was this bombing campaign. They believed in victory through air power. That was the idea, that we would not fight World War One over again. We'd not have fighting in the mud on the ground. Instead, you would just beat the Germans in the air. And unfortunately, it didn't work. It turned out that fighters, on the whole, won the air war on both sides. Our fighters defeated the German bombers. German fighters defeated our bombers. It was easy to shoot bombers down, much harder to shoot fighters down, so that in the end the fighters won. So our campaign in Germany was actually a failure. I was involved in trying to find out what was going on. I was an intelligence operator operating at the bomber headquarters. But we never really solved the problem. The problem, it turned out after the war, we learned that the main weapon the Germans had was a thing called schräge Musik. Schräge Musik means crooked music.
Yeah.
And that was their name for the secret weapon they had, which was upward firing guns. It was a very simple device, a gun that you had in a fight. You had a fighter airplane, a gun which pointed vertically upwards and a periscope gun sight, so the pilot of the plane could shoot vertically upright. So it meant he could fly along underneath.
Oh, wow.
And was not so visible against the ground. And the bomber was clearly visible straight up. So the bomber was a sitting duck as far as the fighter was concerned. So it was a very simple device. Actually, it was quite amazingly effective. So they shot down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of our bombers, and with a very small group of fighters. And oddly enough, the Japanese had the same thing. The Japanese also had schräge Musik. They shared that with the Germans. And they shot down quite a lot of the American bombers over Japan. But of course, the war in Japan never lasted long enough to make a big difference. But in fact, this way of defending actually was working quite well for the Japanese as well. But anyway, we never understood it. We never found out what was going on. As a result, we never took countermeasures and continued to lose bombers right up to the end of the war. So it was a very depressing and difficult time. About 40,000 young boys were killed on the British bombing campaign. So for us it was a major cause of losses of young boys. And I was the same age as the boys in the planes, so I felt very badly about it. It was a grossly unfair situation, and just because I was a mathematician, I got to have a safe passage through the war. And anyhow, that was the way it was.
So, one more. What do you think was or is the legacy of the atom bomb?
What do I think? What is?
Sort of the legacy of the atom bomb. Sort of what it, I guess, carries on, what it caused.
The latest.
The legacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, the main thing that happened which the public is not so much aware of, is bombs got smaller. And so we, after 1950s, when they started arms race with the Russians, the first thing that happened in the 1950s, we built these enormous hydrogen bombs, which were huge and destroyed whole countries with one bomb. which was the kind of thing everybody was scared with. These were really sort of world-destroying weapons. That was the first thing that got built, because they were easy to build, but just huge. And so we built a lot of those huge bombs, which could have sort of destroyed the whole planet, and grossly out of proportion to any possible need. And that went on for about 10 years. But after that, it turned out then the Air Force generals who were supposed to be using these weapons decided after all they didn't want them. And so the Air Force generals actually made the decision to get smaller and smaller as time went on. So they threw away these enormous bombs. They wanted to have little bombs that they could put onto rockets and deliver much more accurately, and they didn't need to be so huge. So gradually, as the time went on, the bombs got smaller. And that's still happening today. And so if you look at the stockpile as it now exists, and these bombs are not so huge anymore. They're much more like the Hiroshima bomb. They're bad, but certainly good for killing people, but not on such a gross scale, and wouldn't wipe out a whole country. And so in a way, the situation is not as bad as it was in the 1950s. It's not only in the United States, but everywhere else. They like to have bombs that fit onto rockets, which are maybe 100 kilotons or so as standard issue nuclear bomb, which is bad. It's bad enough, but it's not the 20 megatons which we used to have in the 1950s. So, and also the numbers have got smaller. The numbers have gone down from about 50,000 weapons at the maximum. Now we're down to about 5,000, and it's bad enough, but it's certainly, it has become something more close to reasonable than it was at one time. And so the Air Force is no longer just saying the bigger the better. It's on the whole, it's rather more they say the smaller the better, and you want to, from their point of view, you want to have bombs that are small enough to actually be usable, which makes them in a way more dangerous. So it's a very difficult question whether these are any good for anything. I think my view is we'd be much better off getting rid of them totally. In fact, the dangers far outweigh the benefits. But of course, there are some benefits for having these weapons that makes all the big powers considerably more careful. And we're no longer are afraid of somebody like Hitler trying to conquer the world. It's quite clear that's not going to happen, because the nuclear weapons will put an end to it pretty fast. And so you have different kinds of dangers, but there's some which are less and others which are more. So I would say the danger of nuclear weapons is still totally out of proportion to their usefulness. And if we look what happened with biological weapons, it's much more reasonable that biological weapons are officially illegal by international agreement. So you have to hide them. So with no doubt that the Russians have some biological weapons. They always have a record of having cheated on the agreements that they signed, and so we always expect they will cheat, but having the weapons hidden away makes them actually much less dangerous. So even having hidden weapons is a lot better than having them out in the open. So as far as biological weapons are still dangerous, but much less dangerous than nuclear, just because they're hidden away. It means that nobody has any experience with handling. There's no organization for handling them. That was true even in World War II, that both sides had biological weapons in World War II, but they were never used. And the reason they were never used was that the military never got interested in them. They were just stuck away in a secret laboratory somewhere, and so they were not considered, just not considered useful by the soldiers, and so they never gave us any trouble. I think something similar could happen with nuclear weapons if we would simply declare we're getting rid of them, period, unilaterally. That would probably solve the problem to a great extent. It's what Nixon did. President Nixon actually made the decision to get rid of the American biological weapons just by executive action. He didn't ask permission from the Senate. He had he didn't negotiate with the Russians. He just signed a paper saying we're getting rid of the biological weapons, all done in one day. And that could happen with nuclear weapons also. But you need to have a president who has solid Republican credentials, who's supposed to be a hardliner, and somebody like Nixon actually could do it. And something a little bit like that happened with the nuclear weapons. George Bush Sr., the father of the second President Bush, so he was president in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he then made the unilateral move to get rid of a lot of our most dangerous nukes. It was George Bush Sr., he actually got rid of all the Army nuclear weapons. He completely denuclearized the United States Army and the surface Navy. So it was more than half of the nuclear weapons he got rid of just like that, without negotiating, just by unilateral move. And that's the right way to do it. And unfortunately, he stopped halfway. But anyway, he did do, I think, a huge step forward. Well, the Russians have responded to some extent, not totally. They still have some army weapons, but they got rid of a lot of those too. And so the Russians have not quite done the same thing, but they've done very similar things. And the Chinese, of course, have always kept their stockpile pretty small. And they've been quite sensible. So I think we have done, on the whole, not so badly. I mean, the there are three kinds of people who are involved in nuclear weapons. There is the soldiers who actually own them. There are the producers who make a career of making weapons, production people, the industry. And then there are the politicians who are supposed to be in charge. And roughly speaking, I mean, the most sensible are the military. In the military know what war is like, and they know very well that a war with nuclear weapons is going to be a hell of a lot worse for them than a war without nuclear weapons, so they keep them away as far as they can. The politicians, on the whole, regard the nuclear weapons as a great source of jobs. It's essentially, for them, it's a jobs program, keeping the weapons labs going, and it's very important for New Mexico and Tennessee, the Washington State, the three places where they had the big weapons labs. And so for the politicians, it's on the whole just something they like to keep going just because it provides jobs. And the people who are the worst are the technical experts, the scientists, who really are enthusiastic about weapons and always have been the driving force. Anyway, that's sort of my view of the situation. So I blame the scientists very much. And it's roughly speaking the same in India and Pakistan, all the places where they have weapons.
Politicians driving it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I think we should have like a change of people. Larry can go up.
Ask him, necessary for a deterrent for peace,
Nuclear deterrent necessary for peace.
and about the Manhattan Project. How long?
Is a nuclear deterrent necessary for peace?
No, it's not necessary for peace. I think it's very helpful for peace. That's not the same thing as necessary. And it is, I think we could be much safer getting rid of them than having them. That doesn't mean that the deterrent isn't there, but deterrence is extremely uncertain. And it's certain that there are many cases we know in history where it did not work. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The reason that deterrent didn't work, so both sides were prepared to go to war with or without nuclear weapons. So it made it such a bad crisis. And it finally was solved peacefully because Khrushchev gave way. Khrushchev actually gave up what he was intending to do, which was putting missiles in Cuba. So it was a Russian defeat which Khrushchev accepted. We were just damn lucky he did accept. It wasn't. Kennedy was not deterred. You might say Khrushchev was deterred, but I think I would merely say Khrushchev was more reasonable.
You want to ask about the Manhattan Project?
Wait, what? Larry, pick up the question sheet. Look at this. Just
Okay.
maybe like like what
Yeah.
other factors could have been for ending the World War? Something like that. Should
What
have
other
been shown.
factors do you think ended the Second World War?
So which is,
Wait, can you re-ask? I just didn't get that.
This camera's
No, but it's just on him. So.
What other factors do you think ended or contributed to ending the war?
yeah, well, in the case of the Japanese surrender, which is probably what you're mostly talking about, the Japanese surrendered without being invaded, which was an enormous benefit to everybody. Saved certainly a very large number of lives, not having to have a battle in Japan. And there are two main reasons why that might have happened. The Japanese emperor gave two different versions. He gave one talk to the soldiers to persuade them to surrender, and a different talk to the civilian population, to the population at large. They say opposite things, so we don't know for sure which is right. To the soldiers, he talked historically. He talked about his own grandfather, who was the great emperor who modernized Japan and everybody admires. And he said, what you have to do is the same thing my grandfather did, which was to surrender in order to keep the Russians out of Japan. So what happened in 1895, this is the emperor speaking, in 1895 there was a war between Japan and China, and the Japanese won, occupied Manchuria, and so it was a big Japanese victory. But then the European powers, in particular Russia, intervened. The Russians had an army in Japan, in Manchuria, and they told the Japanese to get out of there. They were prepared to fight the Japanese in Manchuria. So the emperor then, this is the grandfather, had to decide should he fight the Russians or not. And he chose to surrender. So he gave up in Manchuria and the Russians occupied it. Until then, 5 years later, in 1905, there was a second war between Japan and Russia, which the Japanese won. So the Japanese came back into Manchuria. So by surrendering in 1895, he kept Japan from being occupied by Russia. So the emperor in 1945 said, I have to do the same thing to keep the Russians out of Japan. We surrender to the Americans, and so we'll survive. That's what he told the soldiers, because he was very uncertain about whether the soldiers would obey the orders, since the tradition in Japan was so strong that you don't surrender. And so he had to hold up this historical example of his grandfather to show that they did once before surrender and got benefit from it. So anyhow, so that's what he told the soldiers. To the civilian population, he talked about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was several days later. And he told the civilian population that he's surrendering because of the bombs. That the Americans have this horrible, cruel weapon, and so they have no alternative but to surrender. For some reason, he thought that would be a more persuasive argument for the general population. The general population, of course, was suffering terribly from the bombings, because the military didn't care. From the point of view of the military, the bombings were just collateral damage. They didn't care particularly. So anyway, the emperor gave those two different versions why he was surrendering. So we don't know for sure, but I think the first what he told the soldiers was actually right. And there is an analysis by the Japanese historian Hasegawa, which says that the real answer is the Russian invasion, that it was to prevent the Russian invasion that Japan surrendered. The bombing was not needed. And I think that is true. But it's like, I mean, it's not, of course, it's not something that's ever really settled.
What do you think Truman's decision was justified? I ask if the decision to drop the bomb was justified.
Was the decision to drop the bomb justified?
So the question is whether the decision to drop the bomb in 1945 was justified. My answer would certainly be no. It was completely unnecessary and certainly did not need to be done in such a hurry. It happened just at the time when the bomb was ready that the events were moving very fast in the world. The Russians were just on the point of deciding to declare war on Japan or not, and at least the Americans could have waited to see what the Russians were going to do before dropping the bomb. But the truth of the matter is that it was not a decision that was made by anybody. It was just sort of built into the whole organization of the bomb project that everything would go ahead as fast as possible. That was just the way they operated, that they had this huge organization set up to build the bomb, to produce it, to test it, and to use it. And so all the apparatus was there. The airplanes were ready in Tinian in the island in the Pacific, where they would take off to deliver the bomb to Japan. Everybody was ready. The bureaucracy was there in motion. So it would have been very hard to stop this. Truman did not need to make any real decision. He only needed just to let the thing go, and it will go. So you can say, in a way, nobody made the decision. It was the organization itself that made the decision. That's just the way military things operate, that you have a plan, and the plan is then so rigid that there's no way you can change it once you've started. I think that was the case, in particularly with the Nagasaki bomb. That was delivered without anybody giving an order. It just happened because that was in the plan. And I think it was also true of the first bomb as well. It could only have been stopped if somebody had made a very strong move. And Truman was not in a position to make a strong move. He'd only just become president. He didn't know much about the military plans. So he just let the military go ahead. But the world would certainly be a better place if it hadn't happened. And
Tell them to the technology one.
Hey, we should switch.
Okay. Okay, I think Harry has one.
Oh.
Oh, did you have
No.
one too?
Can you tell me? Because, like, I haven't been in it yet, so. And Tyler, do you want to be in it, or?
Or just this one more, because actually it happened.
Just tell me. Just tell me.
Go ahead,
Don't
Ian.
mind Harry.
He'll come after you.
It keeps saying video recording stopped automatically.
Ian, sit down and ask your question. question. How long do you think, if they didn't do the Manhattan Project, how long do you think it would have taken, or do you think the world would have pursued it, developing the bomb or atomic science? How would you have visioned it working out if we didn't do that whole project?
Well, of course, there are many different possibilities, but I like to think of it the way that it happened with biotechnology. That this was, I forget the date. It was around 40 years ago, I guess. Recombinant DNA was invented. Recombinant DNA is sort of the equivalent for the biology of nuclear energy for physics. That recombinant DNA was the ability to move molecules of DNA around from one species to another, which was invented by Paul Berg and Maxine Singer. Which gave biology the power to essentially to create new species. And you could make disease germs of all kinds quite easily. So it made biological weapons far more practical. So what did they do? The biologists, they immediately were aware this was a big danger. So Paul Berg and Maxine Singer made a public announcement that they had this new technology.
Guys, you ran out of space?
You have a problem?
No. Okay. Oh, say he has only 4 minutes left.
What happened?
Oh, he only has 4 minutes left. Yeah,
Recording.
I catch on my
There's only 4 minutes left of space on the camera, but it's fine. We can keep going.
Yeah, we can listen anyway. So.
We can keep going.
So they, biologists, Paul Berg and Maxine Singer made a public announcement that this new technology had been discovered, that it should not be used by anybody until they had an international agreement. And they called a conference which was held in Asilomar, in California, for all the biologists of the world to come together and decide what to do. And so this had nothing to do with governments. It was the biologists themselves that took the initiative to control the new technology. And they had this meeting in Asilomar. Meanwhile, no experiments were done. And for about a year, the experiments were not done. And they agreed on a set of guidelines which said which experiments were allowed and which ones were forbidden. And the biologists themselves agreed on the guidelines. And ever afterwards, it has worked. They've had these same guidelines now ever since, for 40 years, and it's wonderful how it has worked. That there's been no public health dangers, as far as we know. The technology has not been used for evil purposes, and it has been a wonderful system. It was devised by the biologists themselves. They understood the problem. And in the end, the politicians came along. I mean, now politicians have made international agreements, more or less, just confirming the same guidelines we had with from the scientists. That could have happened with nuclear weapons. I think that's what should have happened. And if in 1939 we had the chance to do that. In 1939, the war had not yet begun. Fission was discovered. There was about a year before the war started. The physicists could have got together. Especially, I blame Niels Bohr for not having done this. Niels Bohr was in the position that Maxine Singer was in with the biology. So Niels Bohr could have called an international meeting of scientists and decided what to do about fission. Politicians were not interested at that point. They could have had a gentleman's agreement with the physicists not to build bombs, and I think it would have stuck. Of course, I mean, it wasn't a sure thing. You never know. It could have had a agreement of physicists, and some idiot might still have gone ahead building bombs, and you don't know. But it would have. I think there's a good chance it would have stuck just the way it has with biology.
I do have one question. So, you had said earlier that the Russians were a big part of also ending the war as they were invading Manchuria and the Japanese territories. Do you think that if that was not to happen and Russia did not interfere, the U.S. would have continued dropping bombs and it would have eventually ushered the Japanese into surrender?
I don't know what would have happened. I mean, I think history can never be predicted or understood without actually playing it through, and so it's very hard to answer the question. I mean, what is certain is in that case that the process of surrender would have been slower, and there would have been I think very likely there would have been several months of negotiations, but in I don't think a full-scale invasion of Japan would have been needed in the end. It was once the United States was in possession of Okinawa and the naval blockade was complete, the Japanese were not able to move ships around. They couldn't move their troops from one place to another. The Japanese would have been, to a great extent, paralyzed as far as military operations went. So I think we would have. Probably the war would have ended quietly within a year or so, but of course you never can be sure. I mean, nowadays wars don't end.
Yeah. You have one more? One